Welcome, and this panel is called Democratic Cyclicity and the Potential Tyranny of the Minorities. Do demographic trends mean that America is bound to become dominated by one party? And our speaker today is Idan Franco. I would like to give the floor to Idan. Idan, if you can introduce yourself and where you're from.
Okay, thank you so much, Oksana. Good morning, everyone over there. Apologies for not being able to be there physically, and also apologies on the part of my co-author Udi Zomo that is not going to make it, but I will present our paper in his place also. So I am a PhD candidate. Professor Zomer is my supervisor. We are writing and in the midst of writing a book project that have already been published. Two chapters of this book have already been published in very leading journals that I'm going to present those chapters and other parts of the book in the presentation in the time that I got here. And concurrently, I work also at Northwestern University as a researcher. So I will go right to the presentation. So as Oksana said, we are talking about the fortunes of US democracy. You know that demographic trends about minorities, ethnic and racial minorities, are a very central topic in political discussions, both in the media and the academics, and the academia, of course. And we want to reevaluate some of the most standard and most basic and well-known theories about the political behavior of minorities and what that means in terms of public policy in the American political arena for years to come. So when we talk about the minorities, about minorities in American politics, we hope to go back to the 1930s, 1940s, when FDR consolidated the so-called New Deal coalition. Of course, that one of the most important parts, the most important aspects of this political construction was minority groups. And when we talk about minority groups, we are, of course, talking about African Americans, Latinx, the Latinos, Latinas, and Asian Americans. Of course, that throughout the history of US immigration, and when we're talking about Latinos and Asian Americans, of course, there were times when Latinos, Latinx, I'm using like both terms, the trends of immigration were more pronounced and less pronounced, depending on the years. But overall, those three groups are the major minority groups in American politics. And FDR, as I said, since his years as US president, it has been traditionally held that minority groups voted overwhelmingly to the Democratic Party. So first of all, we want to ask, what does it mean, as I said, in terms of the future of American politics? Because if by the middle of the 21st century, we are going to see the white American group becomes the minority compared to the sum of voters coming from minority groups, does it mean that the US is going to be dominated by one party, i.e. the Democratic Party? But we take the 2020 presidential elections, also the 2016 presidential elections, but more so 2020 presidential elections as a litmus test we can also call it like the most stringent test to date of this very convention, that minority groups vote overwhelmingly to the Democratic Party. Because in 2020, we see Trump gaining increased support among each one of the three minority groups that I just mentioned. It was first among African Americans, then it was Latino Americans or Latinx, and Asian Americans. Every one of these three racial or ethnic groups, minority groups, voters pertaining to these minority groups voted in bigger numbers, okay? Voters among them voted in bigger numbers to Donald Trump. How can it be possible that a minority hostile president, the candidate and then his president, gained more support among minority voters? So this is the question that is going to be at the center of this presentation, and also, as I said, what it means for American politics in the future. So first of all, I want to go through some very initial data, just to give numbers to make us think about these voting patterns that we saw in 2020. First of all, let's see, for example, in the case of African Americans, the party registration among African American voters in 2020. You can see that Biden, of course, did not get any percent of Republican registrants among African Americans, whereas Trump gained almost 20% of his African American voters coming from the Democratic Party. This is the first figure that I wanted to show you, just as a initial numbers that we can look at before we delve into the our data of the results of our analysis of why this happened and how can we explain it and what it means in the future of American politics. By the way, I wanted to say that you are free to interrupt me wherever you want, whenever you want, with questions. If something is not understandable, if you want to clarify something, you can of course interrupt me and ask any questions that you want. In terms of the Asian Americans, I'm just going like very rapidly about the data just to give a sense of what we saw in 2020. In 2020, we saw that in almost every large US Chinatown throughout the US, Trump gained more support. In some cases, it was a lot more support, like in Houston, San Francisco. I just wanted to remind you all that in the Chinatown of San Francisco, there was the very symbolic moment when former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, visited there, and in a motivation to help the Asian American community in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when there was a lot of public worry about the situation, if it's safe to go there, if it's safe to go elsewhere, etc., etc. And Trump gained more support in this very symbolic place where this symbolic incident erupted. I just wanted to say in parentheses that, of course, not all. This is something that all of you, I guess, know, but I want to emphasize it, that, of course, not all the Chinatown's residents are Asian Americans, but there are Chinatowns still are important population centers of Asian American communities. especially Chinese Americans, and also it has, of course, cultural significance. But even if we look at row voting data in neighborhoods, for example, in Los Angeles, in the city of Los Angeles, among the top 20 neighborhoods by Asian American population, we see that most of them saw increase in Trump support. In some cases, it was almost 25, around 25 or more % more support for Donald Trump. And in the case of Latinos, we see also, just for as an example, of course, as I said, there are a lot of more examples. In row voting data, we can see that in New Mexico, where Trump gained more support, of course, he didn't win New Mexico in 2020, but among the top populated Latino, in terms of Latino population, counties in New Mexico, Trump gained more support in Leah, Chavez, and Eddy counties. So this is just to give a sense of what big changes we saw in terms of the support, minority support for Trump in 2020. So why does it surprise us? Or why does it auto surprise us? So let's go quickly on the extent accounts, extent theories, as I said at the beginning, about the theme of minority political behavior in American politics. So there are two very central terms or key words that we want to look at. The first is link fate, the concept of link fate, and the second is pan-ethnic solidarity. In terms of African Americans or African American political behavior, we of course are talking about the link fate, which basically means, as the former President Obama once said after the tragic shooting of Trayvon Martin, he said, this could have been me. This is, in essence, the meaning of the concept of linked fate. It means that what happens to other members of my group significantly impacts my own life. So this is a very central topic in the political behavior of African Americans. So it means that if we are seeing a minority hostile, specifically a president or a candidate that said racist stuff like calling Black Lives Matter a movement of hate and et cetera, we don't, of course, need to give an ample of examples. We would expect, okay, that compared to former candidates and former presidents coming from the Republican Party, Black Americans would not vote for that specific president or that specific candidate. But this is exactly what we are trying to understand here. There are articles, the third point that you see on this slide, there are articles and works and other publications that coming from in the last 2 decades that are trying to reevaluate this concept of linked fate, as we are doing here. They are talking about the changing from structural reasoning to more individualistic reasoning. So if we even think about the seminal debates among African American thinkers, even 150 years ago, such as Du Bois and Washington, Booker T. Washington, that Du Bois emphasized the structural discriminatory system of U.S. state, et cetera, because of the slavery, et cetera, and what it meant for the struggles of African Americans. We also saw thinkers like Booker T. Washington that dealt more with the individualistic stories of African Americans that could make it in terms of the American dream, and this is the reason that he ran also is of course professional school, etc., etc. I won't delve in more into that, but this is the kind of changing of theoretical thinking that recent works are dealing with among African Americans. And this is the reason also why we in our study wanted to try to use the concept of racial resentment as a predictor for African Americans or African American voters. This notion of racial resentment, I'm not sure if every one of you is familiar with this concept, but this is a concept that originally was created for white American respondents in surveys that wanted to try and to evaluate symbolic racism. For example, the inclination to not accept the reality, the discriminatory reality that African Americans have to deal with in American life, etc., etc. So, because this notion of racial resentment was created for white American respondents and not originally, and not for African Americans or African American respondents, many scholars did not want or just simply did not use it or have not used it in works about African American political behavior. This is what we do in the part of African Americans, or in the chapter African Americans, that I will go more profoundly later on in the presentation. So this is the first hypothesis, that higher levels of racial resentment will have a positive relationship with the probability of voting for Trump among African American voters. Because if we are, I will stress this point a little further, if we acknowledge that Donald Trump is a minority also candidate in terms of racially related issues, okay, of the Black Lives Matter, as I mentioned, and other subjects of relations between whites and blacks in America, it is probable. This is what we want to explore, as I will show later on. It could be because of a different perspective that some African Americans have or hold compared to the majority of African American voters. Okay, this is the intention in the first hypothesis. Immigration and ethnic solidarity among Latinos. This is the second group that we evaluate and that we explore here. So, of course, if Donald Trump said during the presidential campaign in 2015, 2016, that he wanted to build a wall and that he wanted to minimize the number of newcomers especially from Mexico and Latin America and other Latin American countries, the notion, the standard theories about Latino political behavior would assume that Latinos would negate such an approach coming from a political candidate and president, because the notion is that just like or similar, let's call it that, or similar to African Americans, in the case of Latinos, we are also talking about the notion of ethnic solidarity. Okay, it's not exactly linked fate, but it could be called ethnic solidarity. That basically means that, as you can see in the third point, that Latinos, because of this ethnic solidarity with other Latinos, regardless of country of origin. This is the theory of ethnic solidarity or pan-ethnic solidarity, even more so in the Asian American case that I'm going to talk a little later. They are believed, Latinos, to feel bound by the goals defined by the group. For example, improving immigration policy. It doesn't necessarily mean that if Trump being elected president, I am, as an American Latino or Latina, going to be negatively affected. But if my peers in my social group are going to be affected, I have to negate such an approach like that of Trump. But like in the case of African Americans, we also see in the case of Latinos some reasons to ponder whether this extant theory of ethnic solidarity, especially around the topic of immigration, really is relevant as we think it is nowadays. Because even in history, when we look back at the 1990s, for example, there were some articles like that of de la Garza from Colombia, the late de la Garza, that dealt with the anti-immigration sentiment that some Latinos espoused towards other newcomers, including from Latin American countries. But the La Garza and other scholars of this camp talked about the important place of economic hardships. They talked about the fact that newcomers, Latinos that came to the United States, did not want labor competition with other immigrants. So there are reasons. The important thing here is that there are reasons to think that this extent theory, this standard theory about immigration and its relation to Latino political behavior is not as strong or as accurate as we think it will be in cases like the election for Trump. Are there any questions, by the way, until now? Or any comments? Okay. So this is the background, the theory background for our second hypothesis, which is higher levels of anti-immigration sentiments among Latino voters will be correlated with voting for Trump, just like white voters. This is also a point that is relevant to the first hypothesis, that, of course, racial resentment is strongly associated with voting for Trump among white voters. So we wanted to test, as I said, this notion among African American voters as well. And the third group, in terms of the theory, the literature review that I'm doing right now, is the Asian American groups. So it's more similar to the case of Latino, of course, as I said. Of course, that Asian Americans is a pan-ethnic minority group. It means that members of that group came from a variety of countries with also a variety of ethnic backgrounds, and also as it is said in the case of Latino Americans and Latinx Americans, we are talking about the notion of pan-ethnic solidarity, especially as all of us remember at the time of the COVID-19, which I have already mentioned. In the case of the Chinatown story in San Francisco, we know that there was a rise in violence against Asian Americans throughout the country. And this is exactly the social climate that these extent theories talking about when they expect to see a pan-ethnic solidarity among this very group of Asian Americans. Just like Latinos, Asian Americans generate ideological and organizational mobilization, especially in times of social climate such as the one that we saw during the COVID-19 days, and especially because of the and even more so, and especially because of the role, the central role that Donald Trump, the president then, took in this, of course, political climate that was hostile to the Asian American group. So when we are talking about the relation with China, et cetera, and all of the rhetoric, the Kong flu, the China virus, et cetera, we all remember. But as we saw in the case of the first two groups, also in the case of Asian Americans, we see that there are reasons to believe that these extent theories about pan-ethnic solidarity perhaps are not as accurate as it seems, because even if we look back in history, there were inter-ethnic tensions among Asian origin groups, even within Asian origin groups, specific Asian origin groups like Chinese Americans. We know that there are a lot of geographical divergence among, and diversity, ethnic diversity among the region of Southeast Asia and the Far East, etc., of course, etc. So the notion, and I want to also again emphasize the fact that we are talking about what it means, what the demographic trends means in terms of American politics writ large, and in terms of the public policy proposals or initiatives that we are going to see in years to come, in the coming decades. So the notion that minority groups vote and ought to support overwhelmingly the Democratic Party for these reasons that we see here and that we saw in the case of Latinos and African Americans, this notion is not necessarily accurate and robust as we think it is. Specifically about discussions in the literature concerning the current era of US-China competition, we know that the trade war, because the conflict between US and China is not, of course, a war or something that is like of this kind, but a trade centered competition, economic competition. We need also to look at the discussions in the literature about this very topic, about US-China competition in terms of trade. But these works that deal with this aspect of the US-China relations traditionally ignore Asian Americans. They don't take into account the perspectives of Asian Americans about their about the competition between US and China, especially or in particular, they ignore the specific group of Chinese Americans. While Chinese Americans, newcomers as well as US born of Chinese origin, Asian Americans, what they think, what approaches they espouse in terms of the competition between US and China. And this is the reason why, as in the case of white Americans, we want to test the attitudes of Asian Americans, and in particular Chinese Americans, as I'm going to show later on, in terms of the anti-China trade policy of Trump. I will look at my time. Okay, so I understand that at this stage there aren't any questions, so I'm going to proceed. What we need to remember is that there are two levels of this exploration of minority political behavior that I'm doing here. The first is to look at the fact that minority voters voted in bigger numbers to Trump. Okay, they supported Trump in bigger numbers in 2020. The second level of analysis is asking why they did so, or those who did so, why they did so. So extend theories in terms of the competing accounts, those that acknowledge that some minority support could be present for an hostile candidate or an hostile president and candidate, deal with two leading competing accounts. One is ideology and economic perception. The first saying that African American, Latino, Asian Americans, conservative members that are conservative, voted for Trump. They did so, this is the competing account, okay, to ours, rationalizing this trend, this surprising trend, through the explanation that they did so despite the minority hostile approach of Trump and other candidates. If we look at other cases worldwide, I'm going to talk about it at the end of the presentation. They did so despite his anti-minority approach, and certainly not because of that. Okay, this is the first competing account. The second is dealing with the economic perception. Those that, for example, African Americans, Latinx voters that felt better off economically voted for Trump in 2020, or that felt that the economic situation was worse in 2016, voted for him because he was the contender from the opposite party. So both competing accounts talking about and dealing with the notion that it was despite and not because. Okay, this is exactly the opposite of our explanation. And there is some justice, of course, about this competing account of ideology, because both African American, the African American community and the Latino community or Latinx community are more conservative than other parts of the Democratic camp. Okay, African Americans strongly believe in God, for example, relative to the general public, and in some certain social issues like school choice, abortion, of course, and other social topics that are central in the political discussion. And this is the reason that, as we can see, there is the phrase or the notion of that African American voters are conservative but not Republican. So they're more than they are Democratic, they are conservative but not Republican. They are reluctant to vote for Republican, although they hold conservative attitudes towards some social topics. And this is the reason why our fourth hypothesis is conservatism will have a positive correlation with the probability of voting for Trump among African American voters, exactly like in the case of Latinos or Latinas, that President Reagan, coined the phrase about the Latinx community, that they are Republicans but just don't know it yet, for the same reason, because the conservative inclination among the Latinx community is very pronounced when we compare it to the other aspect, as I said, of the Democratic camp. And you can see here other examples. I don't want to take more time about that, so I'll proceed. The same hypothesis as I said about African Americans, we can see about Latinos, and about the Asian Americans. We see less conservative inclination, although they do not fit exactly to the classical differentiation between Democrats, Republicans, etc. But there is a very big variance by religious group. For example, evangelical Protestants among Asian Americans, there are a lot that are way more conservative than those who are unaffiliated, and also by country of origin, Vietnamese and Filipino. I guess that some of you might have thought about it, of course, when we talk about the variance by country of origin that is existent among Asian Americans, but this is something that extent theories are not paying enough attention to. Okay, so this is also part of of our discussion about the fortunes of the American politics, because of this variance, this very variance among minority groups. So we also hypothesize that conservatism will be positively correlated with the probability of voters for Trump among Asian Americans. And I will go very quickly about the perception of the economy that I talked about 3 minutes ago. We are using the retrospective economic voting, which means in the past 4 years, the economy got better, got worse, etc., and a mix of egocentric, which is my economic situation or the of my family, etc., with a combination with the country, which is sociotropic voting, economic voting, which, as I said, deals with the economic situation of a country as a whole. There is a little note about the Latinx case in terms of the economic situation. We hypothesize, I'm not going to delve into this aspect because I don't want to waste a lot of time, but we hypothesize that because of a political activation. By the way, I invite you all to read our article that is going to be very soon published. It's forthcoming, as I said at the beginning, in European Political Science Review about Latinx anti-immigration sentiments and voting for Trump. There is a political activation of dominant attitudes that the better economic situation is the enabling context of this political activation theory that we are talking about in the chapter and in the article. But this is the 7th and 8th hypothesis. A positive perception will be correlate with the probability of voting for Trump among African and Asian American voters, and the effect of anti-immigration sentiments will be more pronounced on the probability of voting for Trump, and perception of the economy are positive. This is the 8th. So I'm going to write directly to the results part. not before I'm going to say in a word what data sets we used, which data sets we used, sorry. Data from the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, the American National Election Studies, and the Democracy Fund UCLA Nation Scope Survey, which combined, we are talking about 100,000 respondents. This is a very large N that we are talking about here. Specifically in the CCES, we are talking about 50,000 responses from potential voters gathered through a survey with the National Survey Sample, etc., etc. Of course, I guess a lot of you are familiar with that, and if not, I can give more details, of course. In terms of the independent independent variables, as I mentioned throughout the presentation, with the hypothesis that we hypothesize, we have three main independent variables for each minority group: racial resentment for the African American groups, which is a sum of 5 questions. If there are questions about that, you are warmly invited to ask me here in the presentation. If you see the recording, if you watch the recording, you can read more in the article that was published in Politics, Groups, and Identities. And you can email me, etc., etc. But basically, we are talking about a sum of 5 questions. We use the canonical battery of questions of racial resentment. Just the innovation, as I said at the beginning, is that we use it for African American voters. Okay, so for example, we talk here about the agreement with the statement of generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Blacks to walk their way out of the lower class. This statement, which expresses a specific worldview, has a significant political implications in terms of public policy, of course, because we are talking here about welfare, the bigger government. Whether you support bigger government, whether you oppose it, or whether you oppose it, etc., etc. We can of course expound on that. Anti-immigration, likewise, the variable is sum of 4 questions, each measuring agreement with statements concerning legal and illegal immigration. For example, increased spending on border security by 25 billion, etc. You can see, including building the wall. This is, of course, an outright expression of public policy in terms of immigration, whether you support or oppose permissive immigration policy. And here, as I said, I want to stress this point. If we are talking about the demographic trend of Latinx community becoming more and more important constituency in American politics, if we take it for granted that Latinos or Latinas are more supportive of permissive immigration policy, then it has a very clear direction of where America's immigration policy is going to, okay? But what we are showing in our project is it's not necessarily that way, okay? Latinos and Latinas are more diverse even in terms of immigration, not to mention other social matters. And xenophobia, in the case of Asian American voters, is one of 4 statements. Each measuring support for proposals on the topic of trade policy, because, as I said, the trade war is the current state of the competition between US and China. And other competing accounts, as I mentioned also, is the perception of economic situation, also explained that earlier, an ideology, which is, of course, the traditional variable. So this is the results for African Americans. I will try to go through as much as I can. So you can see that this is the racial resentment levels among African Americans nationwide. You can see that in Florida, for example, where Trump won impressively, more than 3%, there were higher levels of racial resentment among Black voters. We also know that in some cities, like Miami Gardens, right next to Miami, of course, which is a very big population center of Black Americans, Trump gained a lot more support in 2020. We explain at least big portion of that trend by by racial resentment. It means, in other words, that African Americans that are way more or a lot more than expected, African Americans that do not share the extent, the consensual perception of race-related issues, of race relations in America than previously thought. If we compare between Georgia and Florida, where in Georgia Trump lost after carrying the state more than 5% in 2016, he lost in 2020. You can see that also in the map, you can see that, of course, above Florida, we can see Georgia, where racial resentment levels among African Americans were lower than in Florida. You can see here that in the breakdown of the 10 highest levels of the scale, because it's five questions, a sum of 5 questions, it ranges from 5 to 25. So the 10 highest levels in this scale of racial resentment, you can see that the share of the highest level of 25 in Florida is way larger than in Georgia among African Americans. What it means is that in Florida, African Americans were way more racially resentful, than Black Americans, African Americans in Georgia. We know also, based on exit polls, that male Black voters were more supportive of Trump than female Black voters. Of course, the same pattern is existent in the case of white Americans and in general population. So you can see here that in the pattern of female voters among African Americans in Georgia and in Florida is very similar, whereas the pattern between male voters, Black voters, in Georgia and in Florida is different. And what makes the big difference is, as I said, those racially resentful African American voters. You can see here the dramatic increase in male voters in Florida. In Wisconsin, which Trump almost carried again in 2020, you can see that almost third among African American voters in the state are racially resentful per the dummy version of the variable that I can explain more if you wish. In terms of the regression analysis, you can see that the more racially resentful they responded among African Americans, the higher.
I just wanted to say that in about like a minute or two, we will let the audience ask questions so that they have 10 minutes for questions, because we have about 10 minutes left of this session.
Okay, so 2 minutes, and I will go briefly about what left. There is a very small portion. So the other results are similar. We can see in terms of Latinos that the higher anti-immigration sentiments, the higher support for Trump. We also have the same analysis We also see that the better the economic perception, the more pronounced the anti-immigration effect, as we hypothesize, and it means, of course, the regression is the results of the regression are significant, etc. I can go back to that in the questions sessions if there is a necessity. Conclusions, 10 seconds of conclusions. It means that cyclicity is safe. We cannot be sure that America is heading towards a one-dominated political arena, as some maybe assume because of the democratic trends. And it also means that in other cases, France, Germany, Italy, Brazil, where we see similar patterns, similar trends, it doesn't mean necessarily that there, where we see populist heads of state, that minorities would not vote for such candidates, etc., etc. And maybe I will let the audience, and maybe I will get back to some of that because of the question.
Thank you, Dan. I would like to give the audience in the room a question, an opportunity to ask questions. If there are any questions?
We have a question from one of our in-person attendees.
I'm just wondering, for the 2024 election, if you were advising Joe Biden, particularly with these phenomena going on in swing states, what does he need to focus on? He has to hold together a broad coalition, including people who are very progressive and all these other groups, and hold the center and hold the minority. So what kind of advice would you give to him? And he also doesn't seem to have the same passion among his supporters that Trump has among his.
Yes, great question. So very rapidly, we already see, and you can read a lot of news articles that are talking about that the Democratic Party is losing ground among minority voters. This trend is continuing coming to the 2024 elections. So what it means, it means maybe that calls among Republicans to espouse a more permissive, for example, a more permissive immigration policy in order to attract voters from the Latinx community, for example. It means that such an approach is mistaken, because we can see that in California and New Mexico, etc., as I mentioned, you can see that there are growing numbers of Latinx voters that espouse such policies. Well, I think just in a very rapid an answer, I think that the problems that President Biden is facing nowadays is bigger than that, because he also has a popularity problem among the general public, regardless of minority groups. Of course, also is one of his major problems is among in this stage is among young voters. There are, as you mentioned, accurately mentioned, because of less enthusiasm. Okay, if we compare it to past election cycles, of course, with Obama, etc. And what I think the answer is that I'm not going to give a projection, but what I can say is that the trends are continuing. Yeah, the trends are continuing, and it has a lot of it means a lot of impact on the American political arena for years to come.
Thank you. Oksana, do we have any questions from the online audience?
We do not at this moment. But
Okay,
if
I have another question from the in-person audience.
Thank you. Thank you for such a thorough presentation. And I'm interested about the changes. I mean, has your research shown the changes in the Latinx population? For example, in the past, the Cuban population, we knew that they were going to vote Republican, and it was sort of like an idea. But now we have the people after that came to the U.S. after Mariel, and some others that is a mixed situation. And then we have, for example, the Venezuelans, that Venezuelan Americans, and many of them will vote Republican, most of them, because of the Chavez effect, right? Maduro and so on and so forth. But then we have other mixed Latinx populations. So is it, I mean, my question is, if I understood you correctly, that that in the future we will see changes in the voting behavior of the Latinx population, because they not all vote Democrat, and some of them are voting Republican because they feel that they are not being understood, and they are just all put in a same sort of like box, as all of them are the same, without really listening to their voices and the issues that matter to them. I hope I explained myself correctly.
Yeah, great question. Great question. You know, we begin our article about Latinx voting for Trump in the anecdote that in 2020, the presidential campaign, Trump asked in a rally in New Mexico whether you prefer whether you prefer America or Latinos. Okay, so we are seeing here also some social trends that are bigger, maybe, or besides the political implication of them. They are concerned with the identity of Latinos, or Latinx Latinos, that are growingly more seeing themselves as American, rather than the more identity group centered notion of Latino or Latin. But you know, this is very interesting because you mentioned the Venezuelan community in the United States, and it's very interesting because Biden administration initiated an immigration program of a humanitarian parole for Venezuelan and other countries, Cuba and other countries of Latin America. And even though the Biden administration is a lot more permissive in terms of immigration policy, we are talking about public policy, as you accurately state, we see this trend of growing numbers of Latinos and Latinas voting for or supporting the Republicans and Trump specifically. It means that, again, we see here changing identities from more a group-centered to the general identity of the national identity, maybe, of American. Also, we see, by the way, a growing trend among Latinos of identifying themselves as white rather than as Latino or Hispanic. Okay, we see growing numbers of Latinos until to the point that there are some surveys that already do not use the term Hispanic as a race / ethnicity in their surveys, because there are so many Latinos compared to the past that identify themselves as white. So yeah, so you stated, yeah.
We have one, I'm sorry for interrupting, but we have to end at 12:40 because we have another session starting in this room.
Oksana, sorry, it's at 12:50. We still have 10 minutes.
Well, I have another session that begins at 12:50, and I think I have to open it at 12:40. So we do need to.
Or-
I mean, yes, because there is another session that starts at 12:50 in this room for me.
Just one
But
sentence.
there is one question from the online audience, so we have like 1 minute for that.
Okay. Okay.
How do you define the term white resentful Afro-American? Please elaborate. That's from Leslie.
Okay, racial resentment is a concept that used for white Americans. It means basically a symbolic racism. It means that they want to, those who are racially resentful do not believe that Black Americans deal with discrimination. Okay, so it means that they are racist in the way that they do not accept the social struggles of Black Americans. So if Black Americans are scored or score higher in this racial resentment scale, it means it could mean, it could mean theoretically that they are racist against other Blacks, but of course that it's not probable. What it means, maybe this is our theory, is that they are simply do not share the same conventions of race relations in America. They are, for example, Clarence Thomas. I guess you are all familiar with Clarence Thomas, the U.S. Justice. Clarence Thomas voted in the decision, U.S. Supreme Court decision, to repeal the affirmative action that helped, of course, many African American students. All of you are familiar with that. And he has one of the only two U.S. Supreme Court justices that are African Americans voted as a U.S. Supreme Court justice to repeal this program. So this policy. So this is exactly what we are talking about. There are a lot more Clarence Thomases, so-called Clarence Thomases, among African Americans that we assume there are.
Yes, thank you, Dan. And I just checked. That is correct. This session ends at 12:50 and another one starts at 1. So if the audience in the room has more questions, we still have 8 more minutes. My mistake.
No worries. We don't have any more questions here, but I think we can leave the remaining time to the speakers to make any final comments.
Yeah. Okay. Just a very small note to end. Because of a time issue, as you saw, I could not go through all of the figures and results that we have to present, but that's okay, because as I said, you can and you are warmly invited to check them in the articles that Professor Zomer and I published in academic journals for the African American group and for the Latinx group. You can see there the elaboration, you can see there more figures, etc., etc. And that's it. So I will not, go back to the presentation because that's it. So thank you all, and you are, of course, warmly invited to email me with any comment, with any questions, and thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to put your email in the chat?
Of course, we're going to. Thank you so much. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.